And joining us now is Congressman Michael McCaul, Republican from Austin. Thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Phil. It's good to be here.
So let's just first start on, you were going to be at the Texas Tribune Festival on a panel called the Threat Assessment. What kind of topics are you going to cover? What are the threats today that we need to be worried about?
Well, I'm honored to join my friend and former Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, who I worked with when I was Chairman of Homeland Security. And I think we're going to talk a lot about the threats at the time he was Secretary and I was Chairman, that being Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Caliphate, but now the sort of growing threats that we're seeing from foreign nation adversary states like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And obviously, right now, the situation with Iran is getting very, very dicey, to say the least. And these are becoming more of the bigger threats of the day. And as I transition to be the top ranking member on Foreign Affairs Committee, I'm spending a lot of my time focused on that right now.
And, speaking of Iran, I mean, you coming and talking about this is really happening at a very important time. Big picture question on Iran is, do you think that we're doing the right thing? And by we, I mean in the Trump administration, because, John Bolton just left the administration over some of these issues. In your opinion, is the Trump administration doing the right thing over Iran?
I think overall they have, and I'll tell you why. I think they've showed restraint, a measured, thoughtful approach. Remember, in a situation like this, any miscalculation could lead to a war. And I know personally, having been in the White House, the president said he has no interest in creating a new war in the Middle East. He's more interested in winding them down. And so, Bolton had a more hawkish sort of approach to these things. I do think, Saudis got hit really hard, 50% of their refining and petroleum capability, impacting 5% globally. However, there were no U.S. military assets that were hit by this. And so I think what they plan to do is have both our intelligence community and the Saudis sort of make the case to the United Nations Security Council as to what really happened. And in my assessments and my briefings, this was an attack by Iran in the southwest region, both missile and drone attack on 50% of the petroleum refinery capabilities in Saudi. It's a direct act of war on Iran. And now the question is, what should be the response to that?
And, we're pretty solid allies with Saudi Arabia on a lot of things. Saudi Arabia and Iran have been beefing for a long, long time. When you talk about, that this was an act of war against Saudi Arabia, I mean, should we be worried that there will be a lot of pressure to involve American troops and Americans in the next steps? I mean, because people have seen this book play out before on other conflicts.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And in my discussions with Secretary Pompeo, I think the approach here is to make the case to the United Nations. We don't want to go this alone, and neither do the Saudis. And I think we need to make an appeal to the United Nations and also to our European counterparts to join us in the maximum pressure campaign, which is actually it's very effective right now in terms of crippling Iran's capability, both economically and militarily, and they're getting very desperate right now. And so this is one reason why, I signed off in my position on the weapons sale to Saudi Arabia, because we'd prefer to have the Saudis, with our training and support, defend themselves rather than throwing the Americans in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. How do you, best case scenario, how does this end? Because we already have a lot of sanctions on Iran. We have already kind of pressured them in ways militarily and economically. How is this going to end?
Well, I think the president would tell you, if he has the world community behind him, to bring Iran really to its knees in a position where he can negotiate a better deal than the the Iran deal, the JCPOA. And that would be a nuclear-free Iran without ballistic missile capability and without a terror organization. And so that is ideally, I think, the end result that everybody's hoping for. And I do like the measured approach because just like the Cuban Missile Crisis with President Kennedy, I think, we saw back then one miscalculation could have ended up in a very disastrous result in a nuclear nightmare. And he was able to avoid that. And I think that's really what's on the mind of the president is how can I get to an end that is more peaceful than starting a new war. I think that's in everybody's best interest.
And is that somewhat why we saw Bolton leave the administration? Because the administration does want to still talk to Iran, a foe, to try and bring them to the table, right? If you don't talk to your enemies, then it sometimes can only escalate the situation. Is that, should we be seeing Bolton's exit as that?
Yeah, I think so. And I know John Bolton. I like the guy, agree with him on a lot of issues. But there was a little bit of a tension between him and the president on how to handle situations. And you've seen him recently coming out criticizing the president on his approach to North Korea. I think he's more of a hawkish mentality, wanting to go to war. I was in the White House when they made the decision after our U.S. military asset was shot down by the Iranians, and the decision was, what do we do in response? Of course, Bolton wanted to strike back at Iran at that time, which would have ended up killing Iranians. And the intelligence community would tell you that would only energize the Iranian population for the Ayatollah against Israel and the United States. So I think to some extent that was a wise move. And we also hit them with a cyber attack, which didn't kill anybody, but it crippled the Iranian command and control operations, which had a desired effect without causing a major war.
Two more quick questions just before I let you go. What are the next steps in America's talks with the Taliban? What are you going to be involved in, and what's your goal in that situation?
Well, we got briefed by the special envoy, the ambassador to Afghanistan, in a classified space this morning on the latest talks with the Taliban, and we had an open hearing on it today. Look, the Taliban control about 50% of Afghanistan. I think the president is interested in negotiating a peace between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban. The Taliban is currently basically fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Khorasan group, which is a very dangerous group in Afghanistan. But I have my reservations about the ability to negotiate with the Taliban. But we don't have a whole lot of choices on the table to bring this thing to a desired result. I think at the end of the day, I think a residual force, a troop drawdown, but a residual force, it's first priority to protect the homeland in the event something erupts like a Al-Qaeda faction or ISIS that's trying to attack the United States. It's probably the best result we're going to see. But I do commend our State Department for trying to bring a negotiated, peaceful resolution to this very long conflict, which has cost the Americans not only a lot of money, but a lot of lives.
Well, and last question for me. I saw Congressman Chip Roy talk to the Texas Tribune when asked if he was running again. He did not overtly say yes. I've talked to you before that you are running again for Congress, and just wanted to touch base and make sure that is still the case. You're running again for Congress, yes or no?
Yeah, I don't know why people keep asking me this question. I've been pretty clear in my intentions. I have a full campaign operation on the ground. I've got a lot of volunteers. We've knocked on a lot of doors out there, and I've raised a lot of money. I think I've led and represented the people of the 10th District very well. I've had a major leadership position as Chairman of Homeland Security and now on the Foreign Affairs Committee. which is kind of rare up here to be able to do that. And I do think I'm representing the state as well as the nation on these very, very important national security issues.
What's your stance on this Hong Kong situation with the protesters?
Well, yesterday we had a press conference. I joined Speaker Pelosi alongside Chairman Elliot Engel, Foreign Affairs, and all these human rights activists out of Hong Kong. Some have been in prison over there, have escaped, or came to the United States, and it was one of those great moments in Washington where you see both sides of the aisle coming together for freedom and democracy against dictatorship and tyranny, against the Communist Party in China. This repression and crackdown in Hong Kong violates all principles we know as Americans, going back to our founding fathers. And so we have introduced the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which we plan to mark up in committee next week and bring to the floor of the House to send a strong message to the Communist Party in China that the American people are against us and we stand with the people of Hong Kong.
What would that act do? Can you tell me a little bit more about what's the overall goal of this?
It recognizes the original one country, two systems, the sort of quasi-sovereignty of Hong Kong, their ability to be able to elect their own leader as a democracy. And it also would provide for sanctions for those who have cracked down and committed human rights violations in Hong Kong.
Interesting. So, but this, I mean, the relationship between the United States and China, it gets a lot of attention because of the trade war. I mean, let me play devil's advocate here and say, is this something, I mean, won't this somewhat just amp up the pressure on China from our end? Maybe that is the goal in the long run.
Well, I think it's important we stand by our values as Americans, and that's supporting democracy wherever it exists. Taiwan's another example where we signed off on an $8 billion arms sale package to Taiwan, so Taiwan can defend herself from China. China's becoming a big threat to our national security interest, perhaps the greatest. And I think it sends a strong signal and probably would help leverage that situation. And it's been interesting to read the news coming out of China this morning, almost threatening members of Congress for coming out in support of Hong Kong. Yeah, one last thing, Phil, on the Iran, I just want to add, and maybe you can just, the Pentagon's basically doing an assessment, and as is the Saudi intelligence. I think that assessment will be coming out in the short term, which will make the case against Iran for what they have done. And then I think we want to work with our European partners and the United Nations Security Council to bring this to a peaceful end. But make no mistake, this was an act of war, and we will not tolerate Iran's aggression.
When should
and
we
I think
be
the
looking?
red line here is if any American soldier is killed, that's a red line for the president. And another red line is if Iran continues their nuclear capability such to deliver a nuclear weapon, that would be a red line as well.
When should we be looking for that report to come out? You said soon. Any idea of what time, what day that would be?
I would think probably within the next 24 hours.
Well, all right then. That's going to happen soon. I appreciate your time, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Appreciate it.